How do I know the Scriptures is to be believed? Because Jesus Christ has told me so.
You may have noticed a change in the Westminster podcast feed over the past month or so. There's been a new host and some more interview-style content with faculty and some friends of the seminary. And there's definitely more where that came from, and you can expect more discussions with faculty and again, friends of the seminary and alumni, students, things like that, maybe members of the board. But you can also expect to hear some other series in this feed as well. And as for today, we're going to be starting a church history series focusing on John Knox. Now, there's a lot of great history podcasts out there, Hardcore History with Dan Carlin, Martyr Made with Daryl Cooper, and there are others, but there's not really much out there in terms of church history podcasts. And church history is one of the key disciplines of theology and one of the theological distinctives here at Westminster. And we're one of the only Reformed seminaries that require 4 separate courses on church history. Ancient, medieval, Reformation, and modern church history. So clearly we think that church history is important here. And why John Knox? Well, we may go on to focus on other figures or events in church history on this podcast feed, on the Westminster podcast. But John Knox, I think, is one of the most fascinating figures of the Reformation. He had a deep identity as a Scotsman, but he was an international guy. He spent time in Geneva, in Frankfurt, in Scotland, of course, and also in England. And when we think of the Reformation, it's really should be more like the Reformations. Carter Lindbergh's great book on the Reformation is titled The European Reformations, plural. But Knox is a guy who really ties these reformations of his time together because he was such a traveled guy who did ministry in several European theaters, to use a military term that Knox might appreciate. But he's simultaneously one of the most unique figures, yet also the most relatable, and possibly the most controversial. Though, surely, Luther is in the running for that superlative as well. But before I get too carried away here, we'll be introducing the Scottish Tempest, the life of John Knox, episode 1.
Pastor, you look displeased with our tolerance.
Any realm that is ruled by the Pope is not tolerant, madam. It is enslaved.
Stand when I address you.
There is one true God, and therefore one true religion.
Such rhetoric incites revolt.
If a prince strays from God's will, it is not in doubt that they may be resisted. And in your case, as with all women, their sight is but blindness, their strength weakness, their counsel foolishness, their judgment frenzy. Are we to abide a papist and a woman both?
Well then, I perceive that my subjects shall obey you, and not me.
May I sit, madam?
No. You may remove yourself from this council and my court.
My counsel is among the faithful disciples I serve. We have as little need of this court as it has of us. I pray for your soul, madam.
So who was John Knox? There's a sort of pop culture perspective on him. There's this movie that came out in 2018, Mary, Queen of Scots, And you heard a sound clip from that as the intro to this podcast series. And they really sort of present him as this despicable misogynist. And the movie was released in 2018, right in the middle of Donald Trump's first term. And the presentation of Knox is really kind of like a barely veiled cutout for Donald Trump, right? He's a populist rabble-rouser who's a constant thorn in the side of the elite nobility. He's one of the main villains of the movie, really. And the filmmaker's scorn for him is pushing through for all to see. Although, I will say that David Tennant's portrayal is quite good and captures the intensity of John Knox quite well. You can see his fearlessness and boldness portrayed on the screen. But that gives a picture of the sort of modern-day understanding of who Knox was, right? This misogynist, this villain. And for good or ill, he was a man to be taken seriously, and that really shines through. I think of, this might be an obscure reference for the listeners to this podcast, but there is a video game that came out some years ago. And the villains are this sort of right-wing militia cult, and they put out a soundtrack for this video game of these songs that were sort of made to lampoon the idea of this right-wing militia, but the songs were actually very well made, and the sort of right-wing or conservative side of the aisle sort of latched onto these songs and said, yeah, these are actually great, we like these, which is also something that's happened throughout history. Even if you think of the song Yankee Doodle. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a donkey, stuck a feather in his cap, and called it macaroni. And that phrase, it was actually a British song made to lampoon the colonists. They said, you guys stick a feather in your cap and you call it macaroni. And I think I've heard that macaroni was a phrase at the time, or a term at the time, that referred to high fashion. The idea that you guys are sort of backwoods hillbillies and you think you're fancy. And yet the colonists latched onto that song and would sing it themselves and say, yes, that's us. We like that depiction of ourselves. And I kind of get the same feeling from this Mary Queen of Scots depiction of John Knox, where they're depicting him as this horrible villain, but really the side of him that shines through is his intensity and his, again, knack for being a guy that you can't ignore. He has to be taken seriously. And when someone who is as important of a figure with as big of a personality as Knox had, there's going to be room for caricature, to be sure, from both sides. Geddes McGregor, one of Knox's biographers, describes how he is seen by the sort of general public. And he says this, he says, like all great men, he is very susceptible to caricature. The conventional one promulgated by his detractors is singularly unpleasant. A dwarfish boor, long-bearded, long-faced, and long-winded. Narrow-minded, obstinate, and infinitely rude. As in every caricature, there is an element of truth in this." End quote. Now, we'll see caricatures of Knox from the other side later from his supporters. But this caricature that Geddes McGregor is describing is, he's describing this in 1957. And that would have been before the sort of feminist critique of Knox would have really bloomed. So there's that dynamic as well, which you can hear sort of subtly in the clip from Mary Queen of Scots at the beginning of this episode, that Knox hated women, that he was a full-blown misogynist. Well, after recounting a particularly happy day in Knox's life, the baptism of his first son, Nathaniel, which we'll get into a little bit later, Jane Dawson, who's another one of his biographers, addresses this sort of general negative perspective of Knox. And she says, quote, "This particular day in his life has been reconstructed to challenge many of the traditional assumptions made about John Knox. He has been regarded, especially within Scotland, as the personification of the puritanical killjoy, who championed the strictest Presbyterian tenets on all issues and delighted in haranguing Mary, Queen of Scots. Having been claimed as the country's Protestant reformer, Knox's activities in Scotland have taken center stage. downgrading or even excluding other periods of his life. The concentration upon his famous tract with its eye-catching title, "The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women," has given rise to the view that Knox was a misogynist or a woman-hater, and has distorted understanding of Knox's political thought and his other writings. The reconstruction of the happy day in 1557, when Nathaniel Knox was baptized in the English-speaking church in Geneva, offers a sharp contrast to that conventional image. The relaxed and happy John Knox was not preaching or prophesying doom, but behaving as an ordinary father and family man. He was not expounding misogynist ideas, but was surrounded by female friends and about to return to his dear wife. He was not in Scotland bringing in the Protestant Reformation, but was part of an English congregation in a Swiss city. He was not behaving as a puritanical Calvinist, but was joking, laughing, and looking forward to celebration. This biography, that's Jane Dawson's biography, acknowledges and even emphasizes the darker side to Knox with his, quote, holy hatred, increasing intransigence, bouts of depression, and gloomy predictions about the future of Protestantism. By challenging the monochrome portrait of the Scottish reformer that has dominated popular perceptions, it shows the many different shades within Knox's character that make this complex man a fascinating subject. End quote. And Geddes McGregor also describes Knox's softer side by saying, quote, he had a sense of humor, a dry one perhaps, but in view of the hardships he endured, it would not be surprising if he had had none at all. End quote. As we'll see, his life was full of just abject misery. But through it all, he still found ways to crack jokes and to insert levity, even on his deathbed. And he's cracking jokes about heavy subjects, heavy topics in his life that would have had significance to him as a source of suffering. So as with most things, when it comes to John Knox, the truth is just a bit more complicated than it seems, and his supporters and his detractors seem to err on both sides. But again, that's who he wasn't, right? Those are sort of dispelling the myths around Knox. But who was he? I think of him as, if you think of really as Calvin as being the brains of the Reformation, I think of John Knox as more the muscle of the Reformation, the enforcer, that sort of a thing. He was a huge personality. Again, from Jane Dawson's biography, she says, quote, while Calvin strove to minimize the cult of personality threatening to engulf Protestant leaders, Knox, with his showman's instincts, projected a strong personal image. He ensured that the deceptively simple role of the preacher and the prophet was placed center stage and kick-started his own legend. End quote. Now, he was not a systematician. He was educated. He was well educated, actually, under one of the top academics in the world at the time. But he himself was not really a career academic even. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, his education and that a little bit later. But again, sort of as a contrast to Calvin, he wasn't this systematic mind. He was brash. He was a powerful orator. He was strong-minded, resolute, unflappable. He was not a man that you could ignore. And he was the kind of guy who could stare down royalty, look them in their eyes, and not blink. But he was an emotional guy. Believe it or not, he had more emotions than just anger or wrath. He could be very tender. We'll see through his life, he has times of joy, anger, deep sadness, doubt, and depression, the full spectrum of human emotion, really. The very third sentence of Dawson's biography reads, being a man to whom tears came easily, he was probably weeping with happiness. And Dawson she recounts one of Knox's closest friends, Anne Locke, receiving a request for her correspondence with him from John Field. And this John Field had a bit of an uncritical understanding of Knox. Again, from Dawson, quote, within a few years of his death, and not only in Scotland, the image was already looming larger than life. When the radical Elizabethan cleric, John Field, was gathering all the material he could find to support the English Puritan cause. He urged Anne Locke to send anything and everything she possessed from Knox's pen. In an admiring tone, Field, who had never met Knox, commented, "What a heroical and bold spirit he was." Anne sent Field what she had, though she probably smiled to herself at the description, because the man she had known had confided to her some of his doubts, fears, and worries about his less than heroical actions. End quote. So again, he was a mix of brash and tender. W. Stanford Reed, another Knox biographer, describes this more nuanced understanding of Knox. He says, quote, "As to Knox's personality, one finds that considerable disagreement exists among his biographers. Some think of him as the Thundering Scot," which he's talking about Geddes MacGregor there. That's the name of Geddes MacGregor's biography of Knox, the Thundering Scot. So again, read. "Some think of him as the Thundering Scot, while others declare that he was basically timid, if not actually cowardly." Which, by the way, this is me talking here, not Reed. I don't know how really anyone could interpret Knox as a coward, but whatever. Back to Reed. "It might be nearer to the truth to say that Knox was typically human, with his ups and downs of emotion, although we do gain the impression that in situations where he was unsure of himself, he was inclined to be rather timorous and hesitant. Of one thing we can be certain, Knox had a strong sense of humor. Even in the midst of describing the persecution of George Wishart," that's John Knox's hero, "he pauses to tell the merry tale of the violent confrontation between Archbishops of St. Andrews and Glasgow in the doorway to the latter's cathedral. His account of the murder of Cardinal Beaton, again a figure that we'll hear a lot about later, also has some rather wry humor, while at times his description of the Cardinal, Mary of Guise, and others are in much the same vein. His satirical approach was akin to the somewhat acrid humor of John Calvin. Whether we appreciate it or not in our own day, we cannot but feel that such humor betokened a strong strain of hard-headed realism in his makeup that kept him from taking himself too seriously even on his deathbed and enabled him to evaluate situations accurately. This in turn resulted in realistic actions that might at times be taken for cowardice but were in fact simply common sense moves. As a product of St. Andrews and a notary public, Knox had been trained in the academic disciplines of his day and had likely developed a strong bent towards abstract and legalistic thinking. Some writers have commented on the fact that he shows these characteristics markedly in the sermons and hortatory epistles that he wrote during his life. But we should hardly be surprised at this when we remember that his training took place under the supervision of scholastics such as John Mayer. Furthermore, the Scot through the ages has been surrounded by what Robert Louis Stevenson termed a hum of metaphysical divinity. Yet while displaying this tendency, he never lost his practicality, perhaps as the result of his sense of humor. He was the typical hard-headed lowlander." End quote. So that's sort of a picture of who Knox was and who he wasn't. And before we get too far into this, we need to talk a little bit about the methodology of this series, about the sources that I'm using and really just what I'm trying to accomplish. I am not producing a standalone biography of John Knox. I'm not qualified to do that. Like John Knox, I am not a career academic. This isn't an academically peer-reviewed work. It's a podcast. That's what it is. So I'll be pulling lots of information from a few biographies as well as some other sources here and there. And to start off, primarily, as you may have noticed, I'll be using a lot of material from Jane Dawson's biography, which was simply titled John Knox. And this might be one of the most comprehensive biographies of Knox to date. It's certainly one of the most recent and the most modern. I think it came out in 2015. So it benefits from some current historical discoveries that might not have been known when the other biographies that we are citing were done. Things like letters that Knox penned under a pseudonym that have since been conclusively been been determined to have come from his hand. Things like that. So again, Dawson has the benefit of more history, more research having been done, and more conclusive information. And Dawson is also an expert in the sort of late medieval, early modern period of Scottish history. And she has this knack for producing these just really lucid descriptions of what like a day in the life of Knox might have looked like. And she's got probably the clearest understanding of what life was like then and there. And with that said, though, she does focuses really more on the immediate context of Knox's time and not so much on like the global geopolitics that affected Knox and his decisions and his time. And her book, it's not hagiographical by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not overly critical either. She tries to dispel myths on both sides. It's a very fair and a very nuanced take, and also deeply scholarly. It's really a remarkable piece of work. Now, we'll also be using The Thundering Scot by Geddes MacGregor, and this is an older biography from 1957, and it's probably a bit more biased in favor of him, though I'm not going to quite say that it's hagiographical. It does almost sound like he's talking about like a 2-bit superhero, though. The Thundering Scot, like he's going to show up in the MCU or something. But he does provide good information and a good perspective, so it is very useful. It's a very useful book, very useful biography. Everyone says that they're producing a non-biased work, and MacGregor is no different. But when you read The Thundering Scot, you do have to read through a bit of the grandiosity when reading this book. Then there is The Trumpeter of God, a biography of John Knox by W. Stanford Reed. And this book is also kind of old, a little bit dated. It was from 1974, so not as modern as Dawson. And again, this one's probably a bit balanced, but maybe leaning just a little bit in Knox's favor on the whole. And there's lots of big picture, historical milieu work. There's more detail on the geopolitics of Scotland during the time, and even in the context preceding Knox's life, which is very helpful material. And also, this is a Westminster podcast, and W. Stanford Reed was a Westminster man, so we got to give him some props. He was an early grad of Westminster. He studied under Machen, and then he went on to teach history. Again, not church history, just history, at McGill University and then the University of Guelph, 2 of the top universities in Canada. So he's got his perspective, but he's got serious academic chops, and the book really bears that out. It's really an impressive work. And then there is Knox's own multi-volume work, The History of the Reformation of the Church in Scotland. And the benefit of this work is that it comes from his own lips and from the time period, his own hand. The earliest edition that I can find available online is from 1644 on Post-Reformation Digital Library. I got to shout them out. What a great resource they are. And this is a bit antiquated in its Scots prose, but when you read it out loud, it's a bit easier to understand. The problem is that sometimes Knox obscures his own participation in events, some humility there. So sometimes he'll say, a man said this, and it's almost certainly talking about himself, but he doesn't want to say that. So you got to read through the lines, between the lines a little bit with that one as well. And then what we have is the 1644 edition. That's the one I'm going to be using. And this is also a brief biography of Knox. Is at the very beginning of the 1644 edition. It was penned by one Thomas Martin. And let me tell you, it is downright cartoonish. It's worth reading, though, and we spent some time talking about the cartoonish depiction of Knox by his critics, so we should hear it from his supporters as well. It does give us some good perspective on who he was and who people thought he was. And it gives you a picture of the legend that was John Knox, and it's also just kind of fun. There's going to be a smattering of other sources, but I'm going to go ahead. It's a lengthy quotation, but I'm going to read this brief biography of Knox from Thomas Martin in the 1644 edition of the History of the Reformation of the Church in Scotland, and then we'll get into some of the background of John Knox's life. The life of John Knox. John Knox was born in Gifford, near Haddington, in Lothian, the year of Christ, 1505. Of honest parentage, his father was a brother's son of the house Ranfurly, which is an ancient family of gentlemen in the West. When he left the grammar school in the country, he was sent to the University of St. Andrews to study under M. John Mayer, who in those days was very famous for his learning, which particularly did consist in the ergity or disputative part of philosophy, and in school divinity, wherein formerly for many years together almost all learning was placed. In a very short time John Knox became such a proficient that in this kind of knowledge wherein his master most excelled, he surpassed him. And being yet very young, he was thought worthy of degrees in the school. Moreover, before the time ordinarily allowed by the canons, he entered in church orders. Thereafter, laying aside the idle disputes and sophistry of the school, he betook himself to the reading of the ancients, namely of Augustine, with whose writings he was much taken by reason of their plainness and solidity. Last of all, he betook himself to the earnest study of the Holy Scriptures, wherein, having found the truth of God concerning the salvation of mankind fully revealed, he, in good earnest, did embrace it, and freely professed it. Yea, made it his main work to make it known to all men and believed by them, in which work he was very active and vigilant, at home and abroad, namely at home. For the cause of the truth he suffered very much by sea and by land, in mind and in body, among foreigners and amongst his own countrymen, as ye may see in this history of the church, which now here we present to you. Which history, namely so much of it, I mean, as formerly was published, hath gone commonly under his name, because he is the man of whom is spoken throughout the whole history as being most earnest and diligent agent in the ingress of the Reformation in the church. Next, because he hath penned with his own hand, or spoken by word of mouth, the most part of the most remarkable and most useful things of posterity in the history. Thirdly, the whole history is gathered out of his papers and manuscripts, and so ye see why it is generally received to be of John Knox. But to return to his life. He, being constrained for a time to leave his country by reason of the persecution raised in Scotland by then bishops against professors of the truth, he came into England, where for some years he was busied in preaching the evangel of Christ, with a great deal of content and benefit to those that had the happiness to hear him. His chief abode was in Berwick, Newcastle, and London. This was in the days of King Edward VI, with whom he was in great favor and esteem, by whom, being offered a bishopric, he not only rebuffed and rejected it, but with a grave and severe speech declared that the proud title of lordship, and that the great state was not to be suffered to be in the church of God, as having quid commune cum antichristo, that is, somewhat common with Antichrist. King Edward, being dead, the persecution of Mary made him leave England with many other godly ministers who went beyond seas. First, John Knox went to Frankfurt, where for a time he preached the gospel to the English congregation there, from whence he wrote the admonition to England. But being molested there, partly by open papists and partly by false brethren, he was constrained to retire, and from thence he went to Geneva, from whence he wrote his letter to Mary, Regent of Scotland, his appeal to the nobility of Scotland, and admonition to the commons of Scotland. From Geneva, after some years' abode there, he was called home to his own country, the year of Christ 1559, which was the 54th of his age, by the noblemen and others who had taken upon them the general reformation of the Church of Scotland. Where, how soon that the Reformed Church had any liberty, he was settled minister at Edinburgh, where he continued exercising his ministry to his dying day, but not without interruption, by reason of the civil disorders that fell out in those days. During this, his being at Edinburgh, he preached many excellent sermons, whereof there be but few that were printed and conserved to posterity. He not being willing to busy himself with the press, yet some of them we have, as this, namely, which he preached August 19th, 1564, and for which he was forbidden to preach for a time. He, to make known to the world what ground there was to deal so with him, took the care to have this sermon printed, as you will find it at the end of this history. Here I cannot let slip a remarkable passage, which was this: the year 1566, the Earl of Murray was slain upon the Saturday tomorrow after John Knox preached in Edinburgh, whereas he was reading the papers wherein was written the names of those that desired the prayers of the church. He finds a paper with these words: "Take up the man whom ye accounted another God," which he passed without expressing any commotion, and went on with his prayers and sermon. At the end of the sermon he made moan for the loss of that church and state of Scotland had by the death of that virtuous man, and said that as God in his mercy giveth good and wise rulers, so taketh he them away from a people in his wrath. Then he added, "There is one in this company that maketh the subject of his mirth this horrible murder, whereat all good men have occasion to be sorry. I tell him that he shall die where there shall be none to lament him." He who had written the aforesaid words in the paper was Thomas Metellin, a young gentleman of most rare parts, but youthful, and bearing small affection to the Earl of Murray, who, when he heard this commotion of John Knox, went home to his lodging, and said to his sister that John Knox was raving to speak of he knew not whom. His sister replied, with tears in her eyes, "If you had followed my advice, ye had not written these words," and withal told him that none of John Knox his threatenings fell to the ground without effect. And so it fell out in this particular, for shortly thereafter the young gentleman went beyond sea to travel, and died in Italy, having no known man to assist him, much less to lament him. Toward the latter days of his age his body became very infirm, and his voice so meek that the people could not hear him, preaching in the ordinary place, wherefore he made choice of another more commodious within the town, reading to his auditors the history of the Passion, in which he said it was his desire to finish and close his ministry. Thus he continued preaching, though with much weakness, 2 months and more after this retiring, and foreseeing that he was not to remain long with them, he was instant with the council of the city to provide themselves of a worthy man to succeed in his place. Mr. James Lawson, who at that time professed philosophy in the University of Aberdeen, being commended for a good preacher, commissioners were directed from the body of the Church of England, and from Master John Knox in particular, to desire him to come and accept the charge. To the letter that the commissioners carried, after that he had set his hand, he added this postscript: "Make haste, brother, otherwise ye shall come too late," meaning that if he made any stay, he should find him dead and gone. These last words moved M. Lawson to take journey to the morrow thereafter. When he was come to the town, he had preached several times to the good liking of the people. Order was taken by the rulers of the church for his admission, and the day appointed, at which day John Knox himself would not only be present, but also preach, though he could scarcely walk on foot to the chair, which he did with such fervency of spirit that at no time before was he heard to speak with such great power, and more content to the hearers. And in the end of the sermon, calling God to witness that he had walked in a good conscience among them, not seeking to please men, nor serving either his own or other men's affections, but in all sincerity and truth preached the gospel of Christ. With most grave and pithy words he exhorted them to stand fast in the faith they had received. And having conceived a zealous prayer for the continuance of God's blessing among them, and the multiplying of his Spirit upon the preachers who was then to be admitted, he gave them his last farewell. The people did convey him to his lodging, and could not be drawn from it. So loath were they to depart from him. And he the same day in the afternoon was forced to take bed. During the time he lay, which was not long, he was much visited by all sorts of persons, to whom he spake most comfortably, amongst others to the Earl of Morton, who came to see him. He was heard say, "My Lord God hath given you many blessings. He hath given you wisdom, honor, high births, riches, many good and great friends, and is now to prefer you to the government of the realm, the Earl of Mar, the late regent, being newly dead. In his name I charge you, that ye will use these blessings better in times to come than you have done in times past. In all your actions, seek first the glory of God, the furtherance of his gospel, the maintenance of his church and ministry, and next, be careful of the king, to procure his good and the welfare of the realm. If you shall do this, God will be with you and honor you. If otherwise ye do not do it, he will deprive you of all these benefits, and your end shall be shame and ignominy. These speeches the Earl, about 9 years after, at the time of his execution, called to mind, saying that he had found them to be true, and him therein a prophet. A day or two before his death, he sent for Master David Lindsay, Master James Lawson, and the elders and deacons of the church, to whom he said, "The time is approaching for which I have long thirsted, wherein I shall be relieved of all cares and be with my Savior, my Christ, forever. And now God is my witness, whom I have served with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that I have taught nothing but the true and solid doctrine of the gospel, and that the end I proposed in all my doctrine was to instruct the ignorant, to confirm the weak, to comfort the consciences of those that were humbled under the sense of their sins, and borne down with the threatenings of God's judgments. Such as were proud and rebellious, I am not ignorant that many have blamed, and yet do blame my too great rigor and severity. But God knoweth that in my heart I never hated the persons of those against whom I thundered God's judgments. I did only hate their sins, and labored according to my power to gain them to Christ. That I did forbear none of whatsoever condition, I did it out of the fear of my God, who hath placed me in the function of his ministry, and I know will bring me to an account. Now, brethren, for yourselves, I have no more to say, but to warn you, that you take heed to the flock over which God hath placed you overseers, which he hath redeemed by the blood of his only begotten Son. And you, Master Lawson, to fight a good fight, do the work of the Lord which with courage and with a willing mind. And God from above bless you. And the church whereof you have charged against it, so long as it continueth in the doctrine of truth, the gates of hell shall not prevail. This spoken, and the elders and the deacons dismissed, he called the 2 preachers unto him, and said, There is one thing that grieveth me exceedingly. You have sometimes seen the courage and constancy of the Laird of Grange in the cause of God, and that most unhappy man hath cast himself away. I will pray you 2 to take the pains to go unto him, and say from me that unless he forsake that wicked course wherein he is entered, neither shall the rock in which he confideth defend him, nor the carnal wisdom of that man whom he counteth half a god, this was young Lethington, yield him help. But shamefully he shall be pulled out of that nest, and his carcass hung before the sun, meaning the castle he did keep against the king's authority. And so it fell out the next year following, for the castle was taken, and he was publicly hanged, and his body hung before the sun. The soul of that man is dear unto me, and if it be possible, I could fain have him to be saved. They went, as he had desired, and conferred a long space with Grange, but no persuasion could he be diverted from his course. Which being reported, he took most heavily. Yet Grange, at his death, did express serious repentance for his sins. The next day he gave order for making his coffin wherein his body should be laid, and he was that day, as throughout all the time of his sickness, much in prayer, crying, Come, Lord Jesus, sweet Jesus, into thy hands I commend my spirit. Being asked by those that attended him, his pains were great, he answered that he did not esteem that a pain, which would be to him the end of all troubles and beginning of eternal joys. Oftentimes, after some deep meditations, he burst forth in these words, O serve the Lord and fear, and death shall not be troublesome to you. Blessed is the death of those that have part in the death of Jesus. In the evening, which was the last of his wretched life, having slept some hours together but with great unquietness, for he was heard to send forth many sighs and groans, one Campbell and one John Johnston, which 2 waited very diligently upon him, asked, after he awaked, how did he find himself, and what it was that made him to mourn so heavily in his sleep? To whom he answered, In my lifetime I have oft been assaulted with Satan, and many times he hath cast in my teeth my sins to bring me so to despair. Yet God gave me strength to overcome all his temptations. And now that subtle serpent, who never ceases to tempt, hath taken another course, and seeks to persuade me, that all my labors in the ministry, and the fidelity that I have shown in that service, have merited heaven and immortality. But blessed be God, that brought to my mind these scriptures. What hast thou that thou hast not received? And not I, but the grace of God in me. With which he is gone away ashamed, and shall no more return. And now I am sure my battle is at an end, and that without pain of body or trouble of spirit I shall shortly change this mortal and miserable life with that happy and immortal, which shall never have an end. After which discourse a prayer was said near his bed where he lay, which being ended, it was asked if he heard the prayer. He answered, Would to God that ye had heard it with such an ear and heart as I have done. Adding, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. With which words, without any motion of hands or feet, as one falling asleep rather than dying, he ended his life. He was a man endued with many excellent gifts, and with a very great measure of the Spirit. God raised him to be a chief instrument of the glorious works of Reformation. The court clawbacks have been and are displeased with the doctrine touching the authority of princes and civil magistrates, although there was never was a man born who did more heartily receive and reverence civil authority, nor obey more willingly the lawful commands thereof, than he. All his doctrine concerning the civil authority was to correct the corruption brought in by the selfish flatterers who, abusing the simplicity of life, those whom God has placed in authority, maketh them inconsiderately to rebel willfully and openly against God and his Son, and turn all things upside down and undo the poor people of God, for whose good and safety they are placed so high. Likewise, were and are to this day the proud prelates and idle belly-gods highly offended with his doctrines concerning church government, although he intended no other thing but the pulling down of anti-Christianism fully, and casting all tyranny and idleness out of the house of God. Never was a man more observant of the true and just authority of the church rulers, according to the word of God and practice of the purest primitive times. He always urged pressingly due obedience by the people to the faithful pastors and elders of the church. Although he was both learned and eloquent, yet did he not much apply his mind to compose books for posterity, for he was wont to say that God had called him rather to instruct the ignorant, comfort the sorrowful, rebuke the sinners, and confirm the weak living in his time, than to make books for ages to come. Nevertheless, he wrote several good pieces, for besides what we have spoken already, namely, he left these: a learned treatise against the blasphemous Anabaptists, 2 treatises against the Mass, 1 of the Eucharist, some sermons upon Genesis, some also upon the Psalms, an exhortation to all afflicted churches, and advice in time of trouble, the first blast of the trumpet, etc. He died the year 1572 at the age of 62. His body was interred at St. Giles without the church. To his burial assisted many men of all ranks, among others the Earl of Morton, who, as being near to the grave as the corpse was put in, said, by way of epitaph, Here lies the body of him who, in his lifetime, never feared the face of man. So there you have it, the life of John Knox according to Thomas Merton. Now there's some good information there, and it really gives you a picture, again, of the legend of John Knox, of how he was received by his fellow Protestants, his Reformation leaders, his fellow Scotsmen. But a lot of it is pretty over the top. But how much of it is true, we don't really know. There's a lot that we can confirm. A lot of the quotations, hard to confirm, but sounds like John Knox to me. So we'll go ahead and move into a little bit more about his background, where he was born, what was going on during his life. And again, he was born in Haddington, East Lothian, Scotland. Haddington is about 17 miles east of Edinburgh on the banks of the Tyne River. And at this time, Scots were deeply connected with their geographical roots, and Knox was no different. And he, at one point, kind of let it slip how much he really cared about his hometown or his regional identity when he signed a letter to the Genevan pastors as Tinotirius, which roughly translates to a man from the banks of the River Tyne. So he had this sort of regional identity as a man from Haddington, a man from the banks of the Tyne River. And Haddington was in a fertile river valley and was close enough to Edinburgh to have easy access. It wasn't really Haddington. It wasn't really a top-tier Scottish city, but again, it was close enough to Edinburgh to have some of that metropolitan effect rub off on them. They would have had easy access to political news and events, and some of the economic overflow would make its way to Haddington too. So it wasn't a bad place to be, all things considered. And their church, St. Mary's Parish Church, was actually the largest parish church in Scotland. And Dawson, she describes it this way. She says, "The great parish church of St. Mary's, the lamp of the Lothians. This imposing building, set apart from the burgh centre and surrounded by its extensive church yard, lay on the banks of the River Tyne, looking across the water to Gifford Gate, the street where Knox's family lived and where John was almost certainly born." She continues on saying St. Mary's, quote, "was the largest parish church in Scotland and provided a fitting symbol of the longevity of the burgh founded in the 12th century. Its fine stonework and beautifully carved west door portraying the Passion was dominated by its massive 90-foot tower. It was topped with a crown steeple similar to that above St. Giles Church in Edinburgh, and to the great satisfaction of the Haddington citizens, their building was that bit longer than Edinburgh's burgh church." End quote. So Knox would have grown up, maybe literally, in the shadow of this massive church, the largest in all of Scotland. And that is, I think, significant. And Haddington was under the authority of the Earls of Bothwell. And Knox says that his great-grandfather, grandfather, and father all fought and died under the Earl standards. He was proud of this legacy. Again, strong regional identity. He was proud to be a man whose family for generations served the Earls of Bothwell. And it may have been to a point where he was willing to overlook some serious slights from the social local leadership. And we'll see later on in a future episode that on at least one occasion, the local governors side with his enemies. And Knox doesn't really mention it. Yeah, he slams the enemy that they side with, but not them. He leaves them out of it. And that's a window into Knox's mindset. You know, for him, those local ties, they ran deep. And this area, and really all of Scotland at the time, was under a bit of malaise in the aftermath of this battle that was the Battle of Flodden. And in the Battle of Flodden, their king, the King of Scotland, and many of the nobles of Scotland and their children died. And this happened just 1 or 2 years before Knox's birth in 1513. Well, it happened 2 years before his birth, and it happened in 1513. And the bio that we read from the history of the church in Scotland, they said that Knox was born in 1505. It's more likely he was born in 1514, 1515. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But this happened, the Battle of Flodden, in 1513, just a few years before Knox's birth, maybe just a year before Knox's birth. And you might say, who cares? It was before he was even born. What effect could it have had on him? When you have that perspective, you have to think about what the difference would be, in being born in America in the 80s and being born in America just after 9/11. Those are two different Americas and two different experiences. Years ago, I went to a church, and one of the pastors left to be a missionary in Rwanda. This was probably 2013 or 2014. And so that was about 20 years after the Rwandan genocide. But when he would come back on furlough and preach at our church and fill us in on what's going on in his ministry in Rwanda, he would say that it's like ministering to an entire country with PTSD. Now, the Scots didn't suffer a genocide in 1513 per se. But what happened did have a huge effect on their society and on just the general public's mindset. So let's talk a little bit about what happened in the Battle of Flodden, what led up to it. Scotland and England had been at war on and off for centuries, really, until the peace treaty was signed in 1502. The treaty was called the Treaty of Perpetual Peace. Now, if that's not foreshadowing, I don't know what is. Nevertheless, tensions increased for really a number of reasons. One, a Scottish privateer was captured by the English, and King Henry VIII kept saying things like, "I'm the overlord of Scotland," which King James IV of Scotland probably didn't appreciate too much. So things get ratcheted up until James IV declares war with the English. And whenever someone declares war on the English, the French are happy, and so they sort of align with Scotland. They called that the Old Alliance between the French and Scotland. Now, the French and the English kind of used Scotland as a football that they kicked back and forth between each other, and it never really turned out so well for the Scots. Stanford Reed, he describes the situation like this. He says, quote, "To add to the government's problems, neither Scotland's friends nor her enemies would leave her alone. France was forever trying to embroil her with England, to the decided detriment of the Scots, while Henry VIII and later Protector Somerset sought by bribery, and when that failed, by force, to bring her under English control." End quote. Nevertheless, James, in declaring war on the English, he took some pressure off of the French, who were in the middle of their own war with Italy, and the English were on the side of the Pope in their war with Italy, in the French's war with Italy, because the Pope and Italy were fighting the French. So it all gets very convoluted. There's a lot going on, and James IV kind of kicks a hornet's nest in the middle of all this. But the Pope didn't like what was going on in Scotland for that reason. He's siding with the French against them. So he excommunicates James IV, kicks him out of the church. There's some other stuff that happens, but ultimately James IV decides to invade England, and he has some success. They take some castles, and then we come to the Battle of Flodden Hill. This was the largest battle ever fought between Scotland and England. And James of Scotland had the numbers advantage, but the terrain and the weaponry they had weren't very suitable for each other. They had these 18-foot-long pikes that were sort of state-of-the-art military technology at the time. I think they got them from the French. But the terrain that they were on was hilly and marshy. So they couldn't use these 18-foot pikes, which were really best used in an open field, maybe against cavalry. So what the soldiers end up doing is they end up dropping their pikes because they can't use them. And so they're using their swords, which are their sidearms. And this put them at an even further disadvantage against the English, who had weapons that were called bills, that were sort of like a combination of a spear and an axe. And so they weren't the 18-foot long pikes, but they were maybe 6 to 7, maybe 8-foot long spear pole axes. So you have the Scottish using their short swords against these longer weapons, and it doesn't turn out well for them. So James, not lacking in courage, basically makes a push for the Earl of Surrey, who was leading the battle for the English. He was the tip of the spear, so to say. And the last-ditch effort to win the battle and killing the Earl of Surrey does not pay off. And so, at the tip of the spear, he dies on the battlefield. And the English were told to take no prisoners. So many, many Scottish nobles died that day. And, of course, their king, too. And King James, I think, was actually the last king to die in battle. So this whole affair was hanging over the heads of the Scots, and Reed puts it this way, quote, "This was a difficult time in which to enter the world, particularly in Scotland. For James IV had just died on the field of Flodden, ushering 14 or more years of sorrow, terror, and political anarchy, as various factions of nobles fought for control of the crown. At the same time, both the English and the French monarchs sought by intrigue and subversion to dominate the country for their own aggrandizement." MacGregor also points out how disastrous it was for even the common folk when he says, quote, Flodden was a sore subject for the Scots, when there was hardly a young man in the tavern who had not lost his father, nor an old one who had not lost his son on that bloodiest battlefield in Scotland's proud, sad history. Scotland had suffered a terrible defeat at Flodden, after centuries of bitter, vicious struggles against the English. Flodden had left Scotland still independent, politically, yet the memories of Flodden tore even the toughest heartstrings. There was scarcely a man among them who did not sometimes see in his mind's eye the faces of the women who had haunted the streets of the town, inquiring in their agony of every chance passer-by for news of their men, who did not hear at times in his mind's ear the heartbroken sob, the desolate shriek of one woman after another as she learned that her Sandy or her Tam was among the 10,000 who had bravely poured out their blood for Scotland and lay dead on cruel Flodden Field. End quote. So this malaise was resting over really all of Scotland, but Haddington specifically was a nervous place because they were right in the probable invasion path of the English to Edinburgh. That was the general vibe that he was born and raised in. And it makes you wonder if his brashness and his seeming appetite for conflict was a rejection of this tiptoeing that was the result of a societal PTSD. Right? Was he turning his back on that and saying, no, we're going to be bold and brash again? Or was he embodying the brashness of a King James IV that got them into this mess in the first place? Is he carrying on that reckless legacy? Or is he saying, enough is enough? We can't duck our heads forever. Who knows? We'll see. But from his early years, he associated with the local lairds, who W. Stanford Reed described by saying, though they were, quote, by no means wealthy, they were independent, often violent, and closely bound together by blood and feudal relationships. Right, that was his milieu. And Knox was a kind of middle-class type of guy, not quite a peasant, but certainly not an aristocrat. He was constantly offending the aristocracy of both England and Scotland because he conscientiously dispensed with pretense. He was a straight talker who didn't follow the social pomp and circumstance. He spoke his mind and made his very strong opinions known. As he, later in life, ascended the social ladder, by force, really, the nobility would have probably hated him for his humble beginnings. You know, I like to kind of think of him as this gruff, blue-collar kind of guy who the nobles just can't ignore, so they're forced to deal with him. And he comes into their hallowed halls with mud on his boots. And this is from MacGregor. He says, quote, class distinctions were sharp in 16th century Scotland, and from the point of view of the great families of the royal courts, among which it was John Knox's destiny to move in later life, he was and always remained a peasant, every inch of him. So that's kind of the local milieu about what was going on in Haddington, Lothian, in his neck of the woods. But what about the bigger picture? Again, Stanford Reed describes the European situation as follows. And this is a long quote, but it's really worth it to get an understanding of the geopolitics of what was going on, the position that Scotland was in, and the bigger picture of really European history at the time, of the tail end of the medieval period into the modern era. So Stanford Reed says, quote, while the economic and religious developments of a period may be largely dependent upon each other, they have functional relationships that make for mutual and reciprocal influences. We must see Knox therefore in terms of the world in which he lived. Society in the 16th century was changing, expanding, and revolutionary. Old medieval patterns of thought were being discarded, not only by the intelligentsia, but by the ordinary folk, particularly those of middling sort, the merchants, the master craftsmen, and the lesser nobility, who are now beginning to come into places of influence. Advances and developments in trade, industry, politics, and social organization already underway in the 15th century went forward at an ever-accelerating pace through Knox's life. Economic changes were among the most important. With a general rise in population beginning in the third quarter of the 15th century and continuing throughout the 16th, the demand for goods and services increased rapidly. This demand received stimulus from the growth of European silver production and from the introduction of treasure from the New World. Both increased the quantity of bullion available as a medium of exchange. New methods of business, including the development of a more flexible credit system, also helped stimulate the economy. The result was an expansion of industry and trade and inflation. The effect was a series of business cycles or rises and falls in the economy, the low point being in the late 50s. These economic developments inevitably made an impact upon the whole fabric of society. The aristocracy, frequently wealthy in land but short in cash, were greatly affected. No longer required by their national governments as soldiers or as officials, they had to seek incomes elsewhere. This the upper nobility could do by obtaining remunerative but often honorific positions at court, or by dipping by one means or another into the coffers of the church. The gentry, or lower aristocracy, on the other hand, faced a more difficult situation, which often led them into competition with the aristocracy, who were vying with them for lucrative positions, and into conflict with their tenants and serfs who resisted their demands for increased rent and services. Their one hope was frequently the bourgeoisie, or wealthy elements in the town who could provide them with loans, and often with well-dowered wives or well-endowed husbands for their children. The wealthy bourgeoisie, on the other hand, with their increase in trade, craft production, and finance, were assuming a new position in European society. Affluent in cash or credit, but frequently possessing little in the way of land or social prestige, they usually sought to improve their social position and stabilize their investments by marriage alliances with the nobility, by purchasing landed estates, or by winning titles and lands by performing services of various kinds for their own or foreign governments. The rise of the business element in society was to have broad implications for the whole of Western European culture and civilization. One of the most obvious developments accompanying the evolution of a middle class, if we can empty this term broadly, was the growth of urban life. 15th century Italy had already seen Florence, Venice, and other cities rise to new heights of both economic and cultural activity. This phenomenon became common in Europe north of the Alps in the following century. Paris, of course, still retained its dominant position in some respects, but cities such as Augsburg, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg in southern Germany, Antwerp in the Netherlands, and London in England all grew so rapidly in economic importance that they threatened to outstrip Paris commercially or even culturally. The center of life had now moved from the castle and the court to the important urban areas, which meant that city and town dwellers were exercising much greater influence upon the thought and action than heretofore. All of these changes were summed up in the rise of the so-called new monarchies. Throughout the 15th century, the kings of Spain, France, England, and some Scandinavian countries, under various pressures, had gradually assumed greater and greater powers, which tended to change the political structures of Europe. These monarchies labored to free themselves from the old feudal restrictions which curtailed their existence of the royal prerogatives. At the same time, centralization meant a much greater need for money to meet rising administrative costs. 16th century Spain and Portugal were in happy positions of having wealth in one form or another flow in from the Far East or the Far West. The rulers of France and England, on the other hand, without colonies, had to look elsewhere for funds, which meant that they had to depend increasingly upon their own citizens to provide either taxes or loans. As trade was expanding, this should not have been too much of a problem. But since war was endemic throughout much of the century, most governments constantly found themselves in debt, sometimes to such an extent that no one was prepared to loan them money. It was really this situation that brought the fighting between France, England, and Spain to a close with the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1558. The new monarchies of the Habsburgs, the Valois, and the Tudors, therefore, despite their apparent ascendancy, often found their ways beset with many difficulties. The reason for the constant warfare was the perennial rivalry between the Valois, the ruling family of France, and the Habsburgs, who, in the person of Charles V, united Spain and her dominions with the Holy Roman Empire. Countries such as England and Scotland generally remained on the periphery of this conflict. On the occasions, however, when they joined the fray, England usually took the Spanish side because of her age-old conflicts with France, and Scotland by reason of her old alliance with France and her fear of English designs automatically joined the other side. End quote. So the world was a complex place, and the ground was shifting under Scotland's feet. And that's not even to mention the theological upheaval that was beginning to take root with the growth of the Reformation. And this is the world that Knox was brought into. So let's now take a turn and look at his childhood. And it's really hard to know much about his childhood that is definitive. And you can say that we don't know much because the record keeping during the time just wasn't that great. But we know King James IV's birthday, March 17, 1473. We know King James V's birthday, April 10th, 1512. We know Mary Queen of Scots' birthday, December 14th, 1542. Now, I don't think record keeping was the problem. The reason we don't know much about Knox's childhood is because he came from obscurity. It's a testament to his humble origins. He came from nothing and became one of the most consequential men in Scotland, if not all of Europe. And that says a lot. Knox's birth, followed by his baptism, again 1514 or 1515. Theodore Beza puts it somewhere between 1513 and 1515, but it's most likely 1514 or 1515. So he was born at home and then baptized at St. Mary's Parish Church in Haddington, which you'll remember was the largest church in Scotland. And the church would have been central in his early life and really in the life of any Scot at that time. It was by far the largest institution in the land, greater than the government even. Reed points out that around the time of Knox's birth, the church owned more than half of the real estate in Scotland and brought in about £300,000 per year. The Scottish crown during that time only brought in £17,000 per year. That's how much bigger and richer the church in Scotland was compared to the crown. £300,000 to the crown's $17,000. Dawson describes the church's role in daily life this way, quote, "At the start of the 16th century, the intertwining of church and society to form one hybrid body appeared to be the natural and permanent order of things. The church in Scotland was by far the greatest institution in the land, whose presence was found in every corner of the kingdom and in almost all aspects of daily life. Whatever the criticisms of the running of this large European-wide corporation, it would have been almost impossible for most Scots to conceive of life without it. To them, the suggestion would have seemed laughable that in only 3 years' time the church would be seriously challenged and Christendom split following one monk's protest in Germany." End quote. Now, his baptism would have been super elaborate. Lots of bells and whistles, smells and incense, and if he were able to look back on it, he would have viewed it as absolutely idolatrous. And Dawson is so good at painting these pictures of late medieval Scottish life, like I mentioned before. So listen to how she describes what his baptism would have been like. Quote, "A few days after the event, his birth, the midwife would have taken this baby boy from his mother's arms and, accompanied by the godparents and other friends, carried him in procession to the church door. Knox's mother would have remained at home, recovering from the birth and completing her months-long lying in before she left the house. Since he had no formal role in the baptism, Knox's father might also have been absent from the ceremony. One aspect of the ritual was the creation of a symbolic separation between the realms of the sacred and profane, between the godparents and the natural parents. At the church door, the priest and his acolytes would be waiting. They would receive the baby from the midwife and conduct the exorcism element of the baptism on that threshold. This involved blowing on the child, signing with the cross, putting salt in the baby's mouth and spittle on the nostrils and ears. During the baptism, the godparents acted on behalf of the baby, reciting the Pater Noster and Credo, or Lord's Prayer and Creed, renouncing the devil and affirming their faith. At the font, they provided the child's name, and after anointing with holy oil, the baby was immersed 3 times and baptized in the 3 names of the Trinity. A further anointing with holy chrism, the mixture of oil and balm, followed. A coarse linen cloth or hards was probably used to dry the baby, who would then be wrapped in a white tweed or chrism cloth and given a candle. At the close of the ceremony, it was customary for the godparents to make their christening gift to the child they had, quote, raised from the font, and all would depart for a celebration, end quote. Dawson then explains a bit about how Knox would have felt about his own baptism. She says, quote, "This elaborate and highly visual ceremony with its multitude of stages and symbols came to represent for the adult Knox the worst accretions that had grown over the church's worship. Everyone in Scotland would have attended a baptism, and the higher someone's status, the more ostentatious it would have been, with a long tail of participants, each carrying a particular piece of equipment or adding to the clerical presence and dignity of the ceremony with music and color. As early as his first public debate on religious questions in 1547, Knox chose baptism as his chief example of how the church had erroneously added what he called ceremonies that God has not ordained, such as in baptism are spittle, salt, candle, queed, except it be to keep the baby from cold, hards, oil, and the rest of the papistical inventions. End quote. And that description from Dawson is a subtle juxtaposition of the kind of ceremony that Knox would oversee in the future as a minister. Obviously, he's cutting out all of these papistical inventions, these accretions that snuck in over time. So when he was a minister, the baptism ceremony would have been quite different. And she gives an equally lucid description of the baptism of Knox's son, Nathaniel, which would have followed the form of worship that he himself wrote. Quote, "It was a Sunday not like any other Sunday in John Knox's life. As the afternoon came to an end, Knox was standing beneath the pulpit, proudly cradling his newborn son in his arms. Being a man to whom tears came easily, he was probably weeping with happiness. At his shoulder was his close friend, William Whittingham, who had supported him through thick and thin the recent troubles at Frankfurt, and was standing godfather or gossip to him and his son. The minister, Christopher Goodman, Whittingham's friend since childhood, came down from the pulpit after preaching the sermon. These three men of such different temperaments had forged a deep friendship at Frankfurt, and now in Geneva, Knox and Goodman served as co-ministers to the Church for English-speaking exiles, while Whittingham organized the congregation's great biblical translation project. They had all been involved in writing the service of baptism that was about to begin. Before turning to the assembled congregation, Goodman addressed the ritual question to his two friends. Do you present this child to be baptized, earnestly desiring that he may be engrafted in the mystical body of Jesus Christ? Knox had himself frequently spoken the exhortation that followed, which explained to the congregation the purpose of the sacrament of baptism. As a father, the words became charged with new meaning, because it was his son who was joining the church. Knox heard for himself the reassurance, quote, "Our infants appertain to him, God, by covenant. They be contained under the name of God's people." On behalf of the baby boy, Whittingham and Knox repeated together the familiar words of the Apostles' Creed, and the entire congregation joined in the Lord's Prayer. The communal repetition of the prayer Jesus taught his disciples expressed most deeply the experience Knox treasured of being part of one flock, following one shepherd. Through obedience to the shepherd's voice, Christians became members of the people of God, united across all ages. From the basin, Goodman took the water and laid it on the baby's head, and baptized Nathaniel in the name of the Father, of the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Knox experienced a profound satisfaction from the stark simplicity of combining the Trinitarian formula with a simple application of water. In this congregation's worship, the superstitious ceremonies he believed had defaced the sacrament had been banished. Man-made inventions, even signing with the cross, transgressed the maxim for the worship of God that every part must rest upon the words of Scripture alone. Though it might appear spare and unadorned, Knox believed the new form of prayers was the first liturgy in English to follow the Old Testament maxim of neither adding to nor subtracting from the scriptural injunctions. Knox had chosen his son's name with great care. In Hebrew, Nathaniel meant gift of God, and enabled him to express his sense of gratitude and thanksgiving at the birth of his first child. That name fit perfectly with the thanksgiving in the post-baptismal prayer for the rare and wonderful gifts God had given those who had been marked with his sacrament as a token and badge of thy love, and would be numbered among the saints. Knox hoped his son would always wear and acknowledge the badge of his Christian faith, and he probably cherished the thought that his son might follow his father and become a preacher. The final request was that God take this infant into thy tuition and defense. For a Scot like Knox, this phrase was full of strength, with tuition meaning far more than scholarly instruction and extending to guardianship and complete protection. Gone was the custom of naming children after saints and expecting that saint to act as their protector. Similarly, the exorcism of the devil at the start of the baptism had been removed. Instead, Christ was to be the child's defender in the battle against sin and the devil, that aided by divine power, he may so prevail against Satan that in the end, obtaining the victory, he may be exalted in the liberty of thy kingdom. Knox was convinced that a triumphant gazing upon the kingdom of God was the right note to end the baptismal service, celebrating a new addition to the congregation and reminding every existing member of their participation in God's covenant. With the baptism complete, the familiar faces of friends and supporters would have crowded around Knox and his son in the intimate space of the Auditoire Church in Geneva. Like most mothers of the time, Knox's wife, Marjorie, would have remained at home recovering from the birth and would hear all the details later from her friends. End quote. So you can see what Knox's own baptism was like and what he viewed as a biblical Reformed baptism service would have been like. And there are some similarities, but where it counts, they are worlds apart. And I got to tell you, as a Presbyterian, Nathaniel's baptism sounds so much more beautiful to me than whatever was going on in the Catholic Church at the time. An exorcism for a baby? Like, what are we doing, guys? Anyway, that's pretty much how Knox would have entered the world, with all of these accretions that he would later rightly reject. And we don't know much about his father, don't even know his name, but he was probably a merchant or maybe a farmer. His mother was related to the Clan Sinclair in East Lothian, which would have opened opportunities for Knox. And we really only know that because at one point he signed his name as John Sinclair in the 1550s when he was trying to conceal his identity. And when he eventually got a job as a notary, before, or maybe even while, he converted to Protestantism, but more on that later. He got a job working under the husband of another Sinclair woman. So family ties opening up opportunities for him. His father, whatever his status was, must have been wealthy enough to send John to school and to set up John's brother with the family business. So again, not a peasant, or at least not what you would think of when you hear the word peasant, but definitely not a nobleman or an aristocrat. And that older brother who carried on their father's merchant business, his name was William. He's the only confirmed sibling of John Knox, but there were almost certainly many more brothers and sisters. Beyond that, we don't really know much else about his childhood. Again, humble beginnings. There was no real reason for a random peasant's son to be noted, to appear in the record books. So we'll move on to his education. Since his brother William, as the eldest, inherited the family business, John would have needed a different career. And when you were a sort of middle-class family during that time in Scotland, you really had three options: business, agriculture, labor, hard work, or the church. And with William taking one of those options off the table, his brother going into the family business, John had those labor or the church. That's what he had open to him. So it was probably all a part of the Knox family plan to get John into a career in the church. And however you feel about it, it's the biggest show in town. It's the biggest employer, the most successful institution, and the best way to improve your life and or status, really. And this is even more the case if you had any interest in the life of the mind, really. Like, there may have been some secular educational opportunities at the time, but not really in any realistic sense for a guy like Knox. So growing up in the shadow of St. Mary's Parish Church, he would have then started his education at St. Mary's, learning to read by using the liturgical books there. And he must have proved himself to be an intelligent young boy, and he moved along in his studies nicely. And he would have become very familiar there with the Vulgate and the Latin Psalter during the time. And even on his deathbed, there's evidence that when he remembered Scripture, it was that version. You know, it would have been cemented into his mind from that very early age. And on top of that, he would have become really intimately aware of all of the beauty of the elaborate form of worship there. Dawson puts it this way. She says, quote, "Vivid early memories of the colorful drama and intense beauty of Catholic worship, with the singing and the incense rising into the high roof of St. Mary's, probably added sharpness to his later denunciation of these liturgical practices. Precisely because it was so appealing, such false worship was doubly dangerous to him. He later confessed that sometimes he could not stop the heart from making vain imaginations on the Mass, even though he knew it was the fountain of all idolatry." End quote. So he knew the form of worship, the Catholic form of worship. He knew it well. And he even acknowledged its appeal. But just because it's beautiful and appealing to the senses doesn't make it right or biblical. Personally, I know a lot of people who make this mistake to this day. They discover the allure of the Eastern Orthodox form of worship or the traditional Catholic Mass, and they say, well, this is much more elaborate and aesthetically pleasing than what I grew up with. So they swim the Tiber or they go east. I can acknowledge that it is beautiful, but to me, it's really just an antiquated version of a megachurch. The Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, they like to poke fun at the Protestants for our megachurches. But really, this church that Knox would have grown up in, instead of smoke machines, it was incense. Instead of flashing lights, it's elaborate candles and stained glass. I mean, really, there's no church more mega than the late medieval Catholic Church. But Knox also acknowledges that the allure of the Mass. He acknowledges that. He knows that there is an allure there. And that just makes his later renunciation of it all the more principled. He's not, as he makes arguments against the Catholic Church, he's not throwing stones over a fence and not knowing where they land. He knows well what he's talking about. He was raised in it from birth, and as we'll see here in a little bit, worked in that environment. So from there, he would have attended the grammar school of the burg in Haddington, and it was there that he would have begun to study reading, writing, speaking Latin, and he must have excelled enough there to progress to university at St. Andrews in his mid to late teens, where he would study under John Mayer, as we've heard before. Now, again, it's not the musician John Mayer. It's M-A-I-R. Sometimes people call him John Major, M-A-J-O-R, but we'll call him John Mayer. And John Mayer was one of the top scholastic teachers in the world, and it just so happened to also be from East Lothian. And he studied at the same burg school that Knox would have studied at. He was born in 1467, and he studied in Haddington until he went to Cambridge and then the University of Paris, which was the top university in Europe. And he then taught at the University of Paris from the late 1490s until he left for the University of Glasgow in 1518. He then came to the University of St. Andrews in 1533, right about the time that Knox was attending. And at the time, he was one of the most respected academics in the world. But his name doesn't have the staying power of other academics because the scholastic method that he utilized sort of went out of vogue in favor of humanism shortly after his career ended. So he doesn't have that name recognition to this day. But at the time, he was widely known as one of the top academics in the world. And he would have been sympathetic to the Reformation, too. He would defend the authority of general councils over the authority of the Pope, and he would do that in the classroom. So even from his university days, Knox may have been developing a sort of distaste for the papacy. And Mayer's most significant work was the history of Greater Britain. And this probably also influenced Knox's most significant work, his idea for his most significant works, which was the history of the Reformation of the Church in Scotland. So the history of Greater Britain, the history of the Reformation of the Church in Scotland, you can see some commonality there. And there's a woodcut image of Mayer. It's really the only image that we have of Mayer, and you can look that up. But in it, he looks pretty stiff and rigid, probably because the image is carved in wood. But apparently he was a pretty dynamic professor, and he used lots of humor and wit during his lectures. And that's something that Knox might have picked up from him, his sense of humor, because he also knew that a well-placed joke can make a lesson easier to remember. And he utilized that quite a bit in his career. Now, Knox's education, studying under Mayer, would not have been in the humanist variety like Calvin or Bucer, like I just mentioned. He was very scholastic. And some of that can explain the subtle differences in approach and in emphasis between a John Knox and some guys like Calvin. Nevertheless, he did learn to love rhetoric and debate, and he was very good at them. And Dawson points out his use of scholastic argumentation this way. She says, quote, "In the debates and teaching methods and curricula that were raging across Europe's universities, Mayer and Scottish teaching of this period remained within the traditional scholastic camp. Unlike other Protestant reformers such as Bucer or Calvin, Knox did not develop into a humanist scholar and linguist. But he did share the humanist celebration of the central importance of rhetoric. He loved words and language as a delicate and complex tool of communication and used them to paint pictures and convey the colors of emotion at university. He loved words and language as a delicate and complex tool of communication and used them to paint pictures and convey the colors of emotions. At university, he learned how to study texts carefully, and that skill served him well throughout his life. However, he probably most enjoyed the examinations held as debates between undergrads. He grasped the use of syllogism, the building blocks of the scholastic method, and his later writings employed these major and minor propositions with their tidy logical proof." End quote. So he also studied canon law, which would have been a useful skill at the time. There were really two directions you could go with your education in the church. You could go canon law or theology. Now, theology took longer, and it was really just less useful to the church, so it wasn't as fast of a track to promotion as canon law would have been. Quote, "A grounding in canon law was seen as a useful skill in both church and royal government application," end quote. And that Knox, quote, "gained enough of a legal education to allow him to become a notary." So that's his education. Studied at one of the top universities in Scotland, under one of the top academics in the world. So he was set up for success. Was he himself one of the smartest guys in the world? No. But he didn't need to be. And that part of the bio from 1644 that says that he surpassed the master is ridiculous. He never had even close to the academic career that John Mayer had. But again, that wasn't to be his calling, right? He wasn't called to be a career academic teaching in universities. But from there, we can see that he began his career as a Catholic priest and notary after this education. And so he began his ecclesiastical career in 1536 in Edinburgh, when he was ordained first as a deacon and then as a priest by William Chisholm, Bishop of Dunblane, on Easter Eve. And Chisholm was only there because King James V was in town, so he was substituting for the Archbishop of St. Andrews, James Beaton. And this is one of those little quirks of history that ends up being ironic because, several decades after Knox's ordination, Chisholm and his clerical dynasty, as Dawson put it, would become some of his biggest enemies. So the man that ordained him to ministry ends up becoming one of his key rivals. But this is also interesting because Knox, he liked to basically pretend that he was never a Catholic priest at all. Of course, he didn't lie and say that he wasn't or anything like that, but he didn't bring it up, and he considered his call to be the pastor of the church at St. Andrews, at the castle in St. Andrews in 1547. That was what he viewed as the true foundation of his life and ministry. He really didn't consider himself a minister. It's not at all clear that he considered himself a minister in that sense at the time of his ordination in 1536. He was absolutely a churchman, though, and his career was under the auspices of the Catholic Church. But one could see how he would just be treating it like a job like any other. And realistically, there wasn't a whole lot of pastoring going on in the Catholic Church at the time. The church was basically a giant corporate enterprise. It wasn't so much concerned with the true care of souls or the shepherding of God's people. It was concerned with the maintenance of its overgrown artifice. And listen to Stanford Reed describe just how bad things had gotten. Quote, "More important than the worldliness of the clergy, however, was their apparent failure to meet the spiritual needs of the people, particularly of those who had received any education. With the new pressures of an economic upsurge resulting in an increasing demand for hard work and diligence, many felt that life was a serious matter for which they needed spiritual help and guidance. True, there were more than 1,000 churches in Scotland, but of those, over 900 were appropriated to monasteries, cathedrals, and collegiate churches, which either drew the revenues or farmed them out while leaving the care of souls to some starveling, poorly educated vicar who acted as chaplain. We can well believe that frequently the local flock as hungry sheep looked up and were not fed. Neither intellectually nor religiously was the church speaking relevantly to the energetic burgesses or the somewhat insecure lairds. Therefore, when Lutheran and later Calvinistic views began to sweep over from the continent, they received a rather warm welcome from the middle group in society." End quote. So it's not clear at all that Knox would have had really anything to do with the spiritual well-being of really anyone. So it's understandable that he would later look back on his time as a Catholic priest and not really view himself as being a minister of the gospel. And McGregor, he backs up this unfortunate state of the church in Knox's day in his book, The Thundering Scot. He says, quote, "For a boy in Knox's Scotland, that's the decision to pursue a theological education. For a boy in Knox's Scotland, this was not a decision such as a young man is expected to make today if he enters a theological seminary to prepare himself for the ministry. Nor was Knox making the choice Luther had made a few years earlier in entering the Augustinian friary at Erfurt. The action of a boy such as Knox was more like that of a poor American lad in colonial times seeking to entry to the lower ranks of the governmental service. To receive holy orders was to qualify oneself for appointments that would nowadays be performed by attorneys and their clerks. In the sense that every soldier carries a field marshal's baton in his kit bag, every priest might rise to high office in the administration of the state. Knox himself never engaged, as a matter of fact, in what we should nowadays call regular parish work. He became a legal official, an apostolic notary. Though his legal position was of some trust, he was but a cog in the ecclesiastical wheel." End quote. So again, he's not really engaging in ministry. However, ironically, being a former priest actually helped him smooth over doubts about his qualifications later, even if he didn't want to acknowledge that. In 1549, when he entered ministry in England, and we'll get to that, his status as a former ordained priest basically made it so that there weren't any awkward questions about his status as a minister. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for a local ruler to basically just take the entire church of the region with all of its personnel and just switch them from Catholic to Protestant. But with that lack of him doing really any pastoral ministry at the time, it's hard to argue that he was wrong to consider his later Protestant call to ministry as the origin of his ministerial career. And the legend of Knox seemed to be that he was this brilliant academic prospect. Again, we see that in the 1644 bio, but that probably just wasn't true. After his ordination, he didn't really ascend the ranks, and his career pretty much stalled out after that. He wasn't fast-tracked. He never became a bishop or a cardinal. He didn't get a cushy teaching position at a university, nothing like that. Of course, he was sharp, quick-witted, intelligent, well-educated, but he wasn't an academic, not really. He even said himself that he wasn't one for writing scholarly treatises. His skill set was in rhetoric, in debate, in argument, and as he would learn, in preaching. That was his calling. So he was sharp and intelligent, but probably didn't have the blazing intellect or the systematic mind of a John Calvin or a Francis Turretin. So his career in Edinburgh stalled out, so what does he do? He goes home. He goes back to Haddington, where he had strong connections, and he's trying to find a job. And it's at that time, 1540, he is invested as a notary apostolic, which entailed taking an oath an oath of loyalty to St. Peter, the church, and the Pope. McGregor and Dawson, they both point out that this is kind of the rough equivalent of like a country lawyer. And he leverages his connections in Haddington to secure employment by James Kerr of Samuelston, who was probably his uncle, the husband of his mother's sister, or maybe a cousin. He's related to a Sinclair woman of the family of Knox's mother. So he's connected to them one way or another, and we can glean a few things from his notarial instruments, which were preserved. And the first is that he went by Sir John Knox, which was a title that would have been conferred to him on the basis of his priestly ordination. The second is that he was anointed as a, quote, minister of the altar of the Archdiocese of St. Andrews. The third thing we can glean is that his personal motto was non falsum testimonium perhibito, or not to bear false witness. Dawson tells us, quote, though cast in a negative formula, this gives an early indication of one of the fundamental principles of Knox's life, the compelling need to bear witness to what he saw as the verity of truth. It's a little window into who Knox would become, even while he was still a Catholic priest. The seeds of Reformation were planted in fertile ground when it came to John Knox. And this job would have brought him into contact with the local nobility, the middle class, and even some of the peasantry, so he would have been dealing with all kinds of people. And it would assist him in his future endeavors by helping him to build something of a social network and giving him skills that would be useful to him later. In fact, he was quite good at developing these networks. In fact, one note was that he actually had a greater information network than even the Crown later on in his career. We'll hear more about that, but he was really good at leveraging these networks, and he was building them even from early in his career. And so he had a steady, relatively easy life at this point. And Dawson talks about this. She says, quote, as he was approaching his 30th birthday, Knox had a good, steady job and was unlikely to be found worrying where his next meal might be found. He was relatively successful and a credit to his family, living in Haddington, surrounded by kinsmen and people he had known since childhood, whose notarial duties involved meeting and dealing with all sorts of people and their everyday problems. Knox had become one cog in the large organization that was the late medieval Scottish Church. He had been brought within its embrace at baptism, and by entering its career structure, had been actively sustained by the Church through his schooling and university, then trained for his legal position and ordained. The Church had given him the elements that maintained his adult life. He was set apart from the laity and holy orders, and enjoyed clerical privileges. He had a well-paid post that brought status and position in his local society, and the chance of further advancement. As for his future, he was no high flyer, but he might secure a post in the court of the official for the Archdiocese of St. Andrews or obtain a benefice in the church. Like countless other career clerics of the period, he would probably continue to live in some comfort without overexerting himself. However much he later rejected it, Knox owed his early career entirely to the medieval church, and he was a churchman through and through. End quote. So again, he had an easy life, steady income, living in his hometown, providing a needed and useful service. And yet what we'll see in the next episode is that he chooses to give up this comfortable life for a future of uncertainty, strife, misery, suffering. Right? This all makes his turn away from the Catholic Church even more incredible, even more principled. He's putting not just his money where his mouth is, he's putting his very life on the line. Why? Because the thing he desired more than comfort, more than an easy life, was the truth. He probably already had his opinions about the structure of the church, about his place in it. He probably had his doubts. He probably knew that he was more an employee of a large corporation than he was a minister of the gospel, and he probably knew he wasn't alone in holding those opinions. But what was anyone supposed to do about it? What would you do? Like Dawson said earlier, most Scots of the time couldn't imagine a life without the church. So would you? Cast everything you knew aside? Suffer uncertainty? Be cast as a heretic by the only church you've ever known? Would you do that? I don't know. Well, in the next episode, a new player arrives on the scene. And he's a man who solidifies a disparate group of moderately disgruntled Catholics into a movement. A man who is not afraid to stand up to kings and popes. A man who calls Scotland to imagine a church that cares for God's flock. A church that is interested not in worldly treasures and influence, not in property and power, but rather a church that is interested in the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that man who changed everything for John Knox was George Wishart. See you next time.
We have a scourge upon our land. 'Tis worse than pestilence and famine. 'Tis a woman with a crown, who only pretends to worship Christ when in truth she kneels before the Pope. We do not take instruction from Rome. We resist those who would tempt us with indulgences. Deny those who worship luxury. Respect not those who flaunt their excesses and hurl themselves to wealth and the degradations of the flesh.
This has been a podcast of Westminster Media. Westminster Media is a ministry of Westminster Theological Seminary. If you would like to join us in our mission to train specialists in the Bible to proclaim the whole counsel of God for Christ and His global church, please visit www.wts.edu/donate. This podcast was hosted by Brandon McLean Smith and edited by Brandon McLean Smith.